Critique of Pure Reason, translated by Max Muller, 1881 edition, Part 2, Transcendental Logic, page 64. Of Transcendental Logic. General logic, as we saw, takes no account of the contents of knowledge, that is, of any relation between it and its objects, and considers the logical form only in the relation of cognitions to each other, that is, it treats of the form of thought in general. So he says general logic, as we have seen, has nothing to do with the objects of knowledge or the contents of knowledge. So logic, general logic is different from the objects received in intuition. So he says that general logic pertains to the mere form of our thoughts or the mere form of our cognitions. So thus general logic pertains to pure thinking, that is the form of thought itself, and not the content of thought or of knowledge. So he says, but as we found when treating of transcendental aesthetic, that there are pure as well as empirical intuitions, it is possible that a similar distinction might appear between pure and empirical thinking. So general logic pertains to pure thinking alone. So he says, but as we have seen in transcendental aesthetic, there's a difference between pure intuition and empirical intuition. Thus, it is also possible that we can make a distinction between pure thinking and empirical thinking. So general logic pertaining to pure thinking is fine, but we also have to take into account the empirical thinking. Just as we have pure and empirical intuition, there is also pure and empirical thinking. So we have to account for empirical thinking as well. So he says in this case, we should have a logic in which the contents of knowledge are not entirely ignored. For such a logic, which should contain the rules of pure thought only, would exclude only all knowledge of a merely empirical character. So he says that we will have to come up with a kind of knowledge which does not ignore the contents of knowledge, which does not ignore the object received in intuition. Because if we do that, all the knowledge which is of empirical character will be lost, and we will only be left with mere rules of pure thought. So he says it would also treat of the origin of our knowledge of objects so far as that origin cannot be attributed to objects, while general logic is not at all concerned with the origin of our knowledge, but only considers representations, whether existing originally a priori in ourselves or empirically given to us according to the laws followed by the understanding, when thinking and treating them in their relation to each other. So he says that we have to come up with a kind of logic which pertains to empirical thinking, because it itself, such logic, will lead us to the origin of knowledge, as opposed to general logic, which merely deals with representations, which merely deals with our concepts that we have a priori before our experience in our mind or through our experience of objects received in intuition. So he says that we will have to take into account empirical thinking and the content of our knowledge in order to attain any understanding of the origin of our knowledge. General logic merely will give us only considerations of representations which exist a priori in our mind or which are derived. So basically general logic would pertain to concepts that we already have in our mind or concepts which are derived from empirical experience. But since general logic does not directly apply to objects in the real world, namely the contents of our knowledge, we cannot arrive at the origin of our knowledge. So what general logic does is it merely treats different thoughts in a neutral manner, because it does not concern the content of the thought. It merely concerns the logical form of thoughts. So it is confined, therefore, to the form imparted by the understanding to the representations, whatever may be their origin. So he says that general logic is confined, it is merely confined to the form imparted by understanding to the representations, and not to the origin of those representations or knowledge. So he goes on to say, and here I make a remark which should never be lost sight of, as it extends its influence on all that follows. Not every kind of knowledge a priori should be called transcendental, that is, occupied with the possibility or the use of knowledge a priori, but that only by which we know that and how certain representations, intuitional or conceptual, can be used or are possible a priori only. So he says that not all kind of knowledge a priori is transcendental, in the sense that we cannot know the possibility of application of all kinds of knowledge. Thus, not all knowledge that we have a priori is useful to us, or it is not transcendental. Not all a priori knowledge is transcendental, because not all a priori knowledge can be used to represent objects in the real world. So not every kind of knowledge a priori should be called transcendental, but that only by which we know that and have certain representations can be used or are possible a priori only. So there is a distinction between knowledge a priori and possible a priori. The latter is transcendental because we can use the knowledge, such knowledge. So not all a priori knowledge in the form of intuitional knowledge or conceptual are transcendental, because they cannot be used or represented through experience in the real world in the form of objects. So neither space nor any a priori geometrical determination of it is a transcendental representation, but that knowledge only is rightly called transcendental, which teaches us that these representations cannot be of empirical origin, and how they can yet refer a priori to objects of experience. So he says neither space nor any a priori geometrical determination is a transcendental representation, because these representations, certain a priori geometrical representations, cannot refer a priori to objects of experience. So he says only few a priori geometrical determinations, or only few a priori knowledge can be rightly called transcendental, because only few can be used to refer a priori to objects of experience. So the application of space to objects in general would likewise be transcendental, but if restricted to objects of sense, it is empirical. So he makes a distinction between the space which is transcendental and space which is empirical. So this is a very important distinction. He says the application of space to objects in general is transcendental. So when space represents or helps us to perceive an object in general, not a specific object, then space has the quality of transcendentality. But if space is used to understand or to grasp or to intuit a particular object, which is the object of sense, then space becomes empirical. So space has both transcendental and empirical character. So the distinction between transcendental and empirical belongs therefore to the critique of knowledge, and does not affect the relation of that knowledge to its objects. So he says the transcendentality, the difference between transcendentality and empiricity pertains to the critique of knowledge, that is, in the sense that how how certain concepts refer to objects in general, and how certain knowledge pertains to specific objects in the real world. And that gives us the difference between transcendental and empirical. That is, space is transcendental when it refers to or when it is used to understand objects in general. But space becomes empirical when it is used or when it represents an object, a specific object of sense. So thus he say, and since in both cases, in the transcendental realm of space and empirical realm of space, we are concerning ourselves with knowledge anyways, knowledge of objects anyways. He says the transcendentality, the difference between transcendentality and empiricity does not depend on knowledge of objects, the relationship between the knowledge of objects, because knowledge could be empirical as well as pure, but it has to do with the critique of knowledge. That is, it has to do with where the knowledge came from or the origin of knowledge itself. So, on the supposition, therefore, that there may be concepts having an a priori reference to objects not as pure or sensuous intuitions, but as acts of pure thought, being concepts in fact, but neither of empirical nor aesthetic origin, we form by anticipation an idea of a science of that knowledge which belongs to the pure understanding and reason, and by which we think objects entirely a priori. So he says that on the supposition, therefore, there may be concepts. So he says that there may be concepts which are a priori, which refer a priori to objects, which are not pure. So here he makes a distinction between a priori and pure and sensuous. So we have known so far that a priori is not sensuous. A priori knowledge does not concern sensuous intuition, but here he also says that we can also suppose the existence of certain concepts which are a priori but not pure, neither sensuous, but they are acts of pure thought, and they are concepts, and they are not concepts of empirical nor aesthetic origin, and those concepts are anticipatory in nature. So anticipations or presuppositions that we have about the nature of the world are a priori, and they are not pure, because they do concern the nature of reality. They are important in knowing the nature of the physical world, because anticipatory thoughts or propositions that we have in our mind, or the guesses, the preconceived notions that we have about the nature of reality in front of us, are anticipatory in nature, and they are a priori. They are not pure, nor they are sensuous, because they are not sensuous because we don't derive anticipations directly through sensuous experience. So such concepts are anticipations. So they form an idea of science of that knowledge which belongs to pure understanding and reason, and by which we may think objects entirely a priori. So there are certain facts about the world that can be used to think about objects, and those facts are a priori. So such a science and those facts can lead us to an idea of science. So such science, which has to determine the origin, the extent, and the objective validity of such knowledge, might be called transcendental logic, having to deal with the laws of understanding and reason insofar only as they refer a priori to objects and not as general logic, insofar as they refer promiscuously to the empirical as well as to the pure knowledge of reason. So he says that here this kind of science, these facts about the nature of the world, which are anticipatory in nature, such as propositions about the nature of reality, such as our guesses about the nature of the world, could be called transcendental logic. And transcendental logic refers both, it refers promiscuously to empirical as well as pure knowledge. So, an example of transcendental logic would be the example of cause and effect, because if you know about a cause, you can anticipate an effect which is materialized, which could be materialized in the physical world. So the concept of cause refers a priori to the object upon which the effect might be bared. So this kind of fact or this kind of knowledge that we have about the nature of the world is transcendental logic.